welcome to Tell Us More About That. Today we are talking with Dr. Nathaniel Van Kirk about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder.
Whoop, whoop. This is a good episode. This one's getting pretty niche. This is a very specific topic within the under the umbrella of psychology. Like we mentioned in the introduction, all of these topics were picked for a reason, either because we've dealt with them personally, we've dealt with them professionally, or because we just have a genuine, interest in the topic. This one in particular is personal for me. I have dealt with OCD since I was in 8th grade, and talking to Nathaniel, man, what an enlightening conversation. And Nathaniel also opens up that he got into this because he was diagnosed with OCD when he was in college. So he
was 14.
Oh, he was at college. You're right. He was at the UVA tennis camp.
Right.
He was 14. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good call.
Yeah.
Dude, listening's important. But yeah, it's a great conversation. Learn a lot. And if you don't have OCD and if you don't know of someone who does, the whole point of this is there are people guaranteed in your circle and in your life that you'll interact with that do or have dealt with it in some capacity. So the more you can learn about those individuals and how these things impact their lives, the more you'll be able to relate and make more positive connections. So hopefully you will enjoy this episode as much as we did. But enjoy Mr. Nathaniel Van Kirk. So welcome to Tell Us More About That podcast. Today we have Nathaniel Van Kirk. Dr. Van Kirk is a director of psychological services and at the OCD Institute, correct? At McLean Hospital?
Yep.
Okay, great. And I'll let you do a better job of introducing yourself, but if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself for the audience, that'd be awesome.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. So I'm a clinical psychologist. My specialty kind of clinically and research-wise is primarily on OCD treatment outcome, and then kind of barriers that may get in the way of OCD treatment and ways we might be able to augment it to enhance treatment kind of in the long run. So my current role is the director of psychological services for the OCD Institute. So it's a residential partial hospital intensive treatment program for OCD. That I also do a lot of advocacy work, working currently as an OCD Massachusetts, and try to do some kind of outreach and advocacy work around OCD, kind of getting a little bit more education around OCD out into the community, kind of treatments that work, let people know there are treatments that work, and talk a little bit more about that. But that's kind of the brief overview, and I know we'll dive into more, so happy to be here.
Very cool. Well, thank you for joining us. All of the topics that we have on this podcast, we try to, it's a wide range, but we try to find the tether that kind of humanizes these topics that people have maybe heard of OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, but they have no idea what the heck does that even mean? What does it look like? If they don't have it, then it's just something that they probably never really taken time to learn more about. So hopefully by learning about this, I guarantee within like 1 degree, everybody knows somebody who has dealt with this in some capacity. So this will be a really interesting conversation and informative. So thanks for taking the time to join us.
I feel like OCD is, a lot of disorders go sort of misunderstood, but I feel like OCD specifically is one of the more prominent ones that come to mind. What interested you in getting into this specific disorder or the specific area of diagnoses?
Oh, but Jen, you forgot to ask.
Oh, no.
Hard question.
Oh, I just got really interested.
That's okay.
I will come back to that question. So what we've been doing at the beginning is a friend of mine a couple of years ago gave me this like conversation starter game. And so we've just been picking ones at random. So if you could live as long as you wanted to, what age would you choose and why?
I have no idea why I'm randomly picking this number, but I don't know. I feel like to any age, and assuming somewhat good health and able to do it, maybe around 250. I feel like you get a good sense of a whole bunch of different transitions, in those kind of centennial marks. But also beyond that, then might get a little repetitive and lose those closest to you.
Huh.
But that would be if it was maybe I watch a few too many cartoons and things like that, where that's a big philosophical question. But I'll say
Huh.
that'd be cool to break 100 just to see what changes across those years. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great. My head didn't even go past what could be realistic.
Yeah.
So that's funny how different people perceive that.
Can you imagine
too many cartoons, I guess.
all the different things and growth and progress you would see in 250 years? That's crazy.
Yeah, that's a good one. Cool. All right, so back to our regularly scheduled question. Yeah.
Yes. So how did you lean into OCD? What was your original kind of jumping point or interest in OCD?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think, as you mentioned, like many, I didn't really know much about it prior to my interest in it. So my interest really started around high school, and kind of entering into high school, where I actually was diagnosed with OCD. Kind of came out of the blue. As we mentioned and kind of chatting beforehand, I went to undergrad at Virginia Tech and graduate school for my PhD at Virginia Tech. But my OCD actually started up the road at UVA. I went to a 2-week tennis camp there when I was a kid, out to go finish in middle school, about to go to high school. I never really thought about OCD or struggled with it. It hadn't really been on my radar, didn't know anything about it. But at that point, I just something changed during that trip. And I ended up using Purell a lot, and this was before Purell was kind of everywhere.
Oh yeah.
I would joke, I was kind of like the only person that snuck out of the dorms we were staying in, not to go to a party or anything. I went to go check which 7-Elevens carried Purell. It's not what's carried everywhere.
Wow.
And at that point, I didn't really know why I was doing it. I just knew I had this overwhelming anxiety and this feeling like I just had to do it, and I wasn't 100% sure what was happening. Kind of felt like I was losing control of my mind. Really, kind of the ability to trust myself sort of went downhill. And in those 2 weeks, it sort of spiraled out of control. Then when I came back home after those 2 weeks, I know my mom had noticed something was up and asked, and like any good teenager, I said, "No, I'm fine, nothing." Which couldn't have been further from the truth at that moment. But then over the next couple of years, I learned a little bit more about what OCD was, got into treatment. And sort of from there, as I went through that process, I realized that OCD really wasn't well understood, even in kind of the clinical realm at that time. I had, a number of treatment experiences that didn't quite work. I was labeled as treatment non-refractory or or treatment resistant. But then I found somebody who I connected with, who really had good understanding of OCD and really kind of helped me kind of get my life back. And that was sort of when I shifted and decided I want to specialize in OCD and psychology, and specifically doing clinical and research work with treating refractory OCD and understanding what goes into that and what can we do about it.
Gosh, that's wild. That's that's as good of a story as you can, like an origin story to pick what you're going to be studying, and that's amazing. So what were you going to school for originally?
My original plan was to do kind of the MBA route. I wanted to kind of start my own company, and sort of had that kind of business trajectory was where I was initially going. At least at 14, that had been my life plan, which maybe the fact at 14 I was planning out an MBA program was
Right.
probably a sign of the comic times, but that was definitely one of those initial plans that took a pretty hard pivot once I got in. Got into college, started studying psychology. Once I got into grad school, I really kind of figured out what I loved about, OCD work, OCD treatment. Part of it is that's so misunderstood because it can present so many different ways. Yeah. And there's so much, but there's also a lot that we know about it and a lot of good treatment that we can build on. And so that's kind of kept me in that area, in that field.
Is that a typical sort of onset, either whether it's that age or sort of it presenting that quickly? And then you said it kind of spiraled very quickly in those 2 weeks. Is that typical, or does it grow over time?
I think you go do both. So I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a one trajectory, but we do know that it either tends to grow slowly over time and just kind of spread out, or some people do have sort of, I had that kind of sudden onset due to a stressor or a transition time. But it does tend to onset usually kind of in that area of kind of late childhood. Kind of 9 to 12 tends to be one kind of spike, and then we also see sort of another one, kind of a little bit more in adolescence around that high school time. So we also see a lot of the major life transition times tend to be kind of hot spots for OCD to sort of like cross that clinical threshold towards starting to become impairing. And there might be some signs if you look back, but it wasn't really functionally impairing. But it tends to hit in those kind of childhood, adolescence. There is another spike sort of actually right about when going to college. There tends to be a little bit of an onset of intensifying symptoms around that big transition period as well.
Interesting. Can you give us a little bit of a kind of a general version or general definition of like what is your elevator pitch of what OCD is?
Definitely. Well, so, OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, it's changed a little bit over time, but the way it's currently defined is it's a mental health diagnosis that's characterized by what we call obsessions, which are intrusive, unwanted, repetitive, and highly distressing thoughts, images, feelings. But they can also be sort of like these urges or impulses that people have that push their way in when they don't want to have them and tend to go against who they see themselves as being as a person and cause significant anxiety and distress. And then as a result of those, there's compulsions or rituals, which are repetitive behaviors or mental acts. So it doesn't just have to be like an observable behavior, it can also be mental acts that are really aimed at neutralizing whatever fear it is that's kind of pushed its way in, or getting rid of or getting away from for that stressing anxiety or other distress that may actually be kind of pushing its way in. And so the reason why it's such a general definition is that there really is no limit to how many different ways OCD can present.
Okay.
I always like saying it's only limited by the imagination and creativity of the person who's suffering with it.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And so that's sort of why we define those kind of two general ways, but there's a lot of different dimensions of it.
For an OCD diagnosis, does someone have to struggle with both the obsessions and the compulsions, or okay?
Yes, and so there's been a lot of debate on this. Pretty much what we know as of now, pretty much all of the research that we know shows that for OCD to be a diagnosis, there are both obsessions and compulsions. But when we talk about compulsions, the reason I kind of highlighted the mental ritual piece, and these can be like just kind of thinking something over and over again. There's a ritual called rationalizing, where it's trying to think your way out of something, trying to gain certainty about a fear. But if I just think about it enough,
Tony's looking at me because he does that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and it's one of those things that like you happen so much behind the scenes you don't get to see, and it's hard to describe sometimes. And so a lot of times what we find is that when someone is having obsessions but doesn't have compulsions, it's usually because the ritual or compulsion is either sort of covert, has become sort of like found a way to sort of hide it, or is kind of going on in the background in your head, or might be something that is not typically thought of as OCD. But all the research shows us it's typically there, and if someone's struggling to respond to treatment, it's because that ritual, there's usually a sneaky ritual in there somewhere.
Huh. That's
but I think the thing that oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. Sorry, go on.
The final thing I was just going to say about it is that, like, if there's one way to tie together all the pieces of OCD and, like, what it is, it's that OCD is sort of like the never-ending doubt and what-if questions that get to a point where it's almost incapacitating. It's the idea that I have to know something with 100% certainty to make sure that I won't do this thing, or this thing won't happen, or that I know what's going to occur, or that this feeling will go away. Because if I don't get that 100% certainty, I'll never be able to move on with my life, or something terrible might happen. And if you say like, all right, well, 99.995% chance this thing won't happen, to OCD, you're saying, so you're telling me there's a chance.
So you're saying there's a chance. Yeah.
It's all about that drive and need for certainty.
So there's so much to unpack with all of that, but does that lead into, I would imagine, some severe anxiety for people who don't even understand that they have it? So a couple of things that you said there that's really interesting. I want to go back to how you noticed it kind of present itself within your personal story. So you were going to the 7-Elevens, everyone else is going to 7-Eleven in case of Natty Light in Blacksburg, Virginia, and you're going to see, do they have enough Purell in stock? Like what was the catalyst? Did you have like one of these moments of intense change or stress that kind of triggered it? Or what was it hard for you to kind of understand why this behavior was presenting itself?
Well, that time, luckily, it was before I got to Blacksburg. It was Charlottesville, which is less walkable.
Tennis
out.
camp. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's it's one of those things that's really fascinating because at that time, at that age, I don't think I had a good grasp of what I was sort of going through. Um, and I think it meant daily life stressors, divorce, things like that. But like part of it was that there wasn't a single thing where it just shifted. It was more the transition and being there
Huh.
that was sort of like everything just kind of fell into place at that point. And I think that's common with a lot of OCD. Sometimes, about 78% of people will say there's a stressful life event or series of them that precede it. But there's also a number of people who aren't really sure which one it is, or they don't have necessarily like this one moment where everything shifted. They say like this happened and it all shifted. For some, they do have that. So it can take both paths. For me, it was sort of this thing that sort of snuck up while I was there, and I didn't even realize it was sneaking up on me until I kind of reflected on the fact that I was spraying Purell on my tennis racket and on my shoes and like up and down my arms. And if I didn't do that, I just got this overwhelming sense of fear, and I didn't really know what for.
Yeah.
And so it sort of snuck up that way. I was kind of doing whatever I could to try to get rid of that fear and play tennis. But as you can imagine, if everything's covered in Purell, it's really hard to play tennis and win.
Yeah.
Spend most of the time sliding around or dropping your racket. So I didn't do very well during tennis camp, but it was definitely a shift in that moment.
So my experience with this, I was in 8th grade, and my parents, they had just taken me out of public school where I had friends and I loved it, put me into a private Christian school, which I did not want to do, with my brother and sister. And my mom noticed it because it was very similar. What you said resonated in a lot of ways. Like, I knew these things were happening inside of my head. I had no idea why. And I didn't really have the introspection to recognize, like, okay, these things are happening and there is a reason why. So I just let them happen. So
most 8th graders don't.
Right. So my mom, I was writing. It manifested in so many different ways, like light switches, walking in and out of rooms. But the most debilitating was reading and writing. I would reread the same sentence. Oh, I couldn't get through a page. I would write my notebooks. My mom, I remember she looked over my shoulder when I was doing my homework, and this is when it started. My notebooks would be all scratched out for the most part, because I would write and I'd scratch it out. I write it again, scratch it out. So my mom saw it. She just started crying. And I remember when she was crying, I was like, what, is there something wrong? Like, I didn't even, it wasn't something that I accepted.
Yeah.
And it was so incredibly debilitating. And I remember they took me to a mental health practitioner. And when he told me that it was something, and he told me, like, this is OCD, I remember almost to the moment of like being like, okay, well, so it's not real. So this is something I can control. So I was able to, like, I would say 80% success of like stop the behaviors, but what I wasn't able to do was stop the thoughts. So it was like, and I still get them in a lot of ways. Like, it's not something that really goes away, but it's such a wild, when you try to explain it to people, they're like, what? What are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, I love that you brought the fact that the thoughts coming, that they stick around. One thing that makes it so tricky is that a lot of times when OCDs first starting out, the qualifying behaviors are based on things that we all do in daily life, sort of to like get a sense of safety or certainty, or I think of like rewriting things or checking or perfectionism. On OCD latches onto that. It's things that sometimes are valued by a society up to a point where they're until they cross that functional like line. So the thing that we always talked about is that like OCD exists on a continuum in any behavior in and of itself. OCD occurs when a behavior crosses that adaptive zone, becomes non-functional, and it's too rigid or extreme to actually serve its initial purpose, and it kind of keeps you stuck and gets you from being able to move forward.
Yeah.
But then I think the other thing you highlight is the thoughts themselves, right? They're normal thoughts that a lot of us have. We all have random aberrant thoughts that come in. Just when OCD latches onto it, says, you can have all these other thoughts, just not this one, or these three, like, these are unacceptable.
Yeah.
This means a little bit about you, or this, like, you'll never be able to tolerate if you don't do. But all the other random thoughts we have, you can let them go. And sort of like learning to treat those thoughts the same way as every other random thought you have.
And not like, it's the irrationality of a lot of them, of like, if you don't do this, and this is what, like, it was almost embarrassing as an 8th grader to articulate if I don't do this, I know it makes no rational sense, but if I don't do this, someone in my family may die, like, or I won't graduate, or I won't make like you come up with these crazy like scenarios in your head, and it like it fuels the need to do these behaviors. And when you do the behavior, it makes the thought worse because it reinforces. So it's like this terrible cyclical pattern.
Yes. It's the unfortunate thing our brain does, that if you respond to a thought, or like you kind of do something to get rid of that distress, when the stress goes down, your brain goes, oh, so that thought was dangerous.
Yeah.
So that just starts scanning for danger. So it starts looking for that thought. And if you look for it long enough, you're going to find it. And it's sort of like that cycle of spiral out of control.
Yeah, it's wild.
Is OCD, is that categorized as an anxiety disorder, or is it in its own?
It used to be.
Okay.
Yeah, both and. So it used to be considered an anxiety disorder, but one of the things we started to learn over time is that I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions about OCD, is that it just causes anxiety, but we now know that OCD can cause feelings of disgust, like that visceral disgust response, almost like food poisoning. It can cause feelings of what we call obsessional guilt, which is like feeling guilty for something that hasn't occurred yet, or the possibility of something occurring. It can cause all sorts of like other emotions to go with it. It can also just cause what we call not just right experiences, which I always equate to it's almost like the idea of having an itch in the middle of your back that you just can't stop thinking about. And at a certain point, it's like, I'll do anything to scratch that itch and get rid of it because I just can't move forward without doing it. And that's sort of a not just right experience. Is either some feeling in your body that feels off that you have to like do something about. But because of all those, OCD sort of moved into its own category of like OCD and related disorders that involve like both traditional OCD, hoarding disorder, excoriation or skin picking, and trichotillomania or hair pulling.
That's interesting. It's funny. Right before we started, I pulled out my super old DSM-5. It's not even the, what is it, the new one, the TR.
It's like, Jen, what are you going to do with that book?
I just might flip through it, and it's right here. It popped up, but
a little light reading beforehand.
Yeah. It's been a while since I've had to. I mean, I wouldn't even know how to quantify it right now. But even when I worked in a private practice for only a year and a half, but I had two patients that either came to me and were already diagnosed with OCD, but it is one that was so debilitating to them that I wasn't trained in OCD. And so it felt like there was some level of disservice of just not knowing sort of the best treatment for them, and knowing that treatment is case by case, but even knowing really where to start and even having a good understanding of what it looks like, not not with the misconceptions that come along with OCD.
Yeah, and I think that the debilitating piece sometimes is overlooked, especially with you. It's gotten better, but there was a lot of like the depiction of OCD kind of in popular media for a while that only showed a very specific piece, right? Like there's usually just hand washing or fear of germs, but really let out the parts of like fears of like family members dying, or like scrupulosity and sending being responsible for someone going to hell or ruining others' lives, or all these intrusive like kind of thoughts that might come up. That really, by the time that it kind of really gets hold, a lot of people are struggling to maintain jobs, go to school, just socialize, maybe become completely isolated or unable to care for themselves.
So what are the different sort of subcategories of OCD?
Good question. So what we know research-wise so far is there's really kind of four main domains that have kind of come up time and time again. And these are fairly broad domains, but the first one is kind of contamination, or kind of contamination concerns and hand washing, cleaning style rituals. And that's the one I think for a long time got the most attention. Then there's also the next kind of dimension is what we consider fear of harm. So it's a fear of harm coming to self or to others if I don't complete this ritual, or if I don't do something. It's like a hyper responsibility for harm. And a lot of times those go with things like checking rituals, reassurance seeking, asking if everybody's okay, making sure that they're safe, making sure that you didn't do something that might have inadvertently hurt someone without knowing it. Also might be a lot of mental rituals of like trying to check your memory to see if it has gaps or if it's consistent, things like that. Imaging certain situations that might have caused distress to make sure no one was hurt and you're remembering it correctly. And then there's the third one, the dimension 3, which is, I think, one that actually people are starting to share about a lot more, but it's the part of OCD that a lot of times people held back because they're a fear of like what are people going to think. And that's what we call the kind of unacceptable, taboo, sexual, and religious intrusive thoughts. And so this is in the category where you have all those thoughts that we as humans have pop in, but when it pops in for someone with OCD, it becomes, well, what if I'm a serial killer? What if I'm actually a danger to those around me? What if I might be a pedophile and don't know it? And just one day I'm going to snap. How could I risk putting others in harm's way if I'm not 100% certain? And the fact that I have this thought means like, what? I don't know if I'm certain anymore. I don't know who I am anymore.
You almost like can't trust your brain anymore.
Bingo.
Yeah.
And I think the part that goes with that is that people with OCD, especially in that category, will go to extreme lengths to make sure those around them are safe and try to protect the world from themselves or protect themselves from these thoughts. And will try desperately to control their thoughts, to not have them. We've had people that even reported themselves to the police and said, I think I may have done this, or I might have, or I might do it, and I don't know. But can you lock me up just in case? So I want that certainty that others are safe. I think that's the thing that people don't always realize about OCD is the lengths people will go to try to make sure these fears, especially the intrusive thoughts, unacceptable thoughts to me, don't come true and aren't possible. It's sort of like they've lost trust in who they are as a person because there's that, 1% chance, 0.01% chance that life might kind of throw a curveball at you because we're all human. We all have all these different sides. But I think that's one dimension that has gotten a little bit more traction recently. People have felt confident enough to share a little bit more, which I think is amazing, because I think that's one that I hear a lot of stories about people waiting 15, 20 years to share because they were embarrassed or ashamed of the thoughts. They thought no one else had these thoughts. And I always recommend that they play Hard Things Humanity and say, if you think the thoughts that you're having right now, play this game. All humans have it. The question is, are you going to monetize it or run from it? And it's sort of like that's sort of what we do in treatment is try to normalize the fact that as humans, we all have all of these thoughts and questions that come through. But we have to we learn to trust ourselves amidst those.
Yeah.
And then the final one is perfectionism, not just right experiences, which is that feeling of kind of like need for completeness, symmetry, and order that tend to be the next one.
Okay.
So there's a lot of different kind of avenues and ways that this can kind of show up and present itself. And then obviously the long-term effects of, oh my gosh, I don't know what his deal is right now. The long-term effects of how each of those tend to impact the individual, that's going to have a pretty wide variety of outcomes as well. What is kind of the brain science behind what's happening with OCD? Like what's actually being affected?
So there's some neuroimaging studies early on that were pretty fascinating. That like with OCD, what they're finding is that it's sort of the frontal lobe and sort of like your lower frontal cortex. So essentially, your brain's simulation engine, the thing that has been designed to run all possible scenarios that more or less keeps us safe because it allows us to predict scenarios, is sort of hyperactive and is essentially like on full blast all the time. So someone with those either brain is always running sort of list scenarios, even at rest. And so we can see that there's differences in brain activation at rest where it's like hyperactive. And so it's hard to control. So like essentially what ends up happening is the brain doesn't signal that they've completed tasks. It tends to kind of like get stuck on certain beliefs or thoughts that don't have certainty. And then it runs through all potential life questions really, really fast. And so that tends to be what we see is happening in OCD. And there's a whole kind of brain circuit that is actually not sort of malfunctioning in the sense that it's not slowing itself down. So, and that's where you get a lot of checking or doubting of one's personal experiences, their thoughts, because they're sort of running so fast and nothing signaling, hey, this is complete.
Wow. So I'm sure there's tons of different treatment modalities, but what are like the general ways in which you go about helping people kind of deal with this?
And so, like, I think the first piece that probably gets brought up the quickest is medication. So selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors tend to be kind of gold standard frontline treatment for OCD. Slightly higher dosage than you might do in like depression or social anxiety disorder, things like that. But it sort of quiets down that brain. I think of it as like it turns down the volume on the fear so that you can slow your brain down just enough to make a decision. Do I want to engage in this ritual or not? or do I want it to be something that's important to me? There's also been some great developments in neurotherapeutics. So TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, has been FDA approved for OCD, has similar effectiveness to SSRIs. But then the thing that always goes with it, I think a lot of times people are looking for, and myself included when I was going through it, I was like, all right, well, what is the one medication that's going to fix it and make all these go away? The hard learning point was there wasn't one that's going to make it all go away. Just turns the volume down a little bit. But behavioral therapy is exposure response prevention, and a lot of times augmented with cognitive therapy tailored specifically for OCD. ERP is the gold standard treatment for as it stands right now. And we have a lot of new augmentations that are coming up to try to enhance the efficacy for it. But ERP is the most effective method forward. The way I think about it is it's really about teaching you how to face fear effectively. And so we know that fear is always going to be there. Exposure is about learning to face those things that trigger the fears, not rely on the rituals to regulate your emotions, but learn to trust yourself again. That like my body and mind are creating these emotions. If I'm creating them, I can cope with them. If they're not dangerous, just my alarm system's kind of like going a little haywire right now. And so learn to ride that out so that over time, those things that trigger the obsessions and the obsessions themselves are no longer really as anxiety provoking. And the rituals feel like you don't need them anymore because you can cope with it in more effective ways, allow you to live your life. That sort of breaks apart that cycle that we were talking about earlier on. It's a tough treatment. It's very similar to if you're afraid of snakes. We'll tell people, all right, let's go play with some snakes. Which is not usually what anyone wants to hear, myself included,
Yes.
when I go through it. But once I got through it, it's amazing how generalizable the skills you learn are, just to life in general.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking when you'd said how to approach fear effectively. I'm like, oh gosh, everyone could use that. Is ERP? You had mentioned earlier about, you didn't say this, but I think almost neutralizing the emotional response to certain thoughts that you said we kind of cling on to. Is ERP how you almost reframe or neutralize those thoughts to make them, not as emotionally responsive? Okay.
Yeah, and there's really two main ways that it sort of works. One is what we consider like the original model for it was the habituation model, which we know still works. We also know there's other methods that actually are kind of taking a step further, which I can talk about in a second. But essentially the initial idea was if you face the same stimulus over and over and over again, eventually your brain sort of gets bored with it. If you don't do the rituals or the things that like essentially assign danger to it by getting rid of it. So, in my case, I was afraid of, I had a time where I was afraid of hit and run, where I was like, what if all I hit was actually a person? And I would drive the same loop over and over again for hours, hitting the same pothole. And every time I knew I hit a pothole, it's like I'd hit it 50 times now. But then every time I get a little bit further down the road, I was like, well, what if it wasn't a pothole this time? What if it was like a person I didn't realize it? Hey, I can't look at that. I have to make sure I didn't hurt somebody. And I would drive back. And eventually, what I realized in that driving back as well as keeping that fear alive. I had very slowly driven over the same pothole 50, 100 times. But part of it was learning to trust myself again.
So you had mentioned, I'm going to go backwards for a second. You mentioned pothole and thinking you were running over a person. And that is very interesting because of the two clients that I had that struggled with OCD, they had the exact same fear. Whether it was a cone or a curb or a pothole, they had this intense fear of running over a person. Is that a common fear in some capacity?
Yeah, I think just the fear of causing harm is quite common. I think sometimes we hear about the driving one a lot because statistically it's for fairly one of the more dangerous things that we as humans embark on a daily basis. There's lots of lots of fodder for the fear to run with. And so it definitely is one that comes up a lot. Sometimes it could be like just causing an accident by not being careful enough or driving recklessly, maybe accidentally hitting another car or, something like that. A lot of different variations to it, but I think it's a common experience that people have. And a lot of times when we're doing exposures to that, it's sort of this idea that if you drive enough and you learn to, and you don't go back and check, you don't do the rituals, and you don't feed that cycle, over time, your brain gets more and more used to driving, and that uncertainty that like, oh, maybe we did hit somebody and don't know. Going back to check really isn't going to do anything. So I've been driving in circles. Like now I'm just spending most of my time looking in my mirrors to make sure, which is actually probably more dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, I'm just going to trust myself and move forward, and until I know, until later, who knows? We'll see what happens. And it's sort of like leaning into that uncertainty in a way that allows you to kind of trust yourself again, that you probably know the difference, and sort of moving forward. And the more you do that, the less intense the kind of anxiety reaction to those triggers will be, the more that you don't engage in the rituals. And that's the biggest part of OCD treatment, is ritual prevention.
Mm-hmm.
Like without that, that cycle stays alive. If you don't do the rituals, eventually your brain sort of gets used to it. Your anxiety response will go down each time they try it. Sort of like putting your hand in a hot tub, where at first it's like really, really hot, but if you sit in the hot tub long enough, eventually your mind just gets used to it. Your nerves are sort of like, all right, well, this isn't changing. Not dangerous, so let's stop firing because this is just a waste of energy. That's sort of what we're doing in an habituation model.
Okay.
That's interesting. Do you find that when people learn that what they're doing and why they're doing it, when they learn that it's a thing, that it's not real, almost that it's real but it's not real, like the fears are irrational, do you find that people do have like almost immediate like success in just changing some of the behavior because they don't have this, I don't know, it normalizes it a little bit for them?
I think it sort of depends on how long they've had it and the intensity of the fear.
Okay.
A lot of people will say, like, in the moment, like, I know this doesn't make sense, but I just can't take the risk that it might be true.
Yeah.
Or, and so a lot of times, especially after it's been around for a while, when they find out what it is, if they've been doing rituals for a while, it actually creates new learning pathways that essentially have to be unlearned. Wow. It's sort of how all of us as humans, right? We all have that one or two like bad habit that we developed at some point in time that when we're stressed, we sort of fall back on, even though we know like this is probably not the healthiest thing. In grad school, I was stressed and working too much. Couldn't attest to this. I just drank like 2 liters of soda, stayed up all night, and my diet consisted of like, I think it was cherry popsicles and Doritos nachos, which worked for getting my dissertation done.
Sure.
Probably wasn't the greatest for my longevity, but it's a bad habit that you keep falling back on. But I think OCD is the same way. When you're really stressed, you fall back on that thing that's over practiced. And so you have to really practice not doing the rituals, especially if it's been along, and create what we call inhibitory or cocaine pathways. And that's the other way ERP works.
Interesting.
Is strengthening like an alternative pathway that doesn't involve ritualizing, so that you can slow it down enough to realize I have the choice if I'm going to do this ritual or if I'm going to go have lunch, with my family. Am I going to let and sort of that idea that I can tolerate the emotion no matter how intense it is. I am capable of tolerating it without the rituals. Even if it just hangs around, I can just let it hang around. I don't have to do anything with it. I can still go have a valued and enjoyable life, even though I feel anxious sometimes. These thoughts are still there, hanging around in the background.
That sounds complex and really challenging. I mean, it's a mix of, you said ERP and CBT and distress tolerance and emotional regulation and having good social support, it sounds like. And if they were to introduce sort of, maybe it's not a replacement behavior, but maybe it's a replacement action or task, or do they tend to lean into falling into a cycle of ritual with that new behavior sometimes, or?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that, because that is actually one of the biggest pitfalls, I think, sometimes with treatment, is especially early on, if someone hasn't been trained in OCD, sometimes it makes sense, right? We teach people when they're anxious to do things like relaxation training, things like that. Listening loves it when you introduce something that says, if this, then that. So if anxious, breathe this way exactly. OCD's like, great. Now I got to breathe perfectly this way, or everything's gonna fall apart. And so it tends to take those skills and turn them into rituals. So that's why we a lot of times just focus on like learning to allow your body emotions to do what does naturally, and ride it out, or ride the wave, and then can continue with the task in front of you, if you will.
That's what I was thinking too. Yeah, I'm trying to remember what modality it would fall under, but you just said riding the wave. So having this really deep trust and understanding that feelings, emotions, all thoughts, they come in waves. And so how do you ride it out knowing that it will ebb and flow, and you will have moments where it doesn't feel as intense and strongly as it does?
Yes.
Interesting.
I will say with ERP, I always tell people like it is a highly effective treatment. So statistically, its meta-analytic effect size, sort of like its overall efficacy, is 1.41, which 0.8 and higher is a large effect size. It's astronomical for psychology and behavioral health.
Wow.
But I also tell people it's also one of the hardest things to do, because we're essentially asking you to face your worst fear head on over and over and over again, and not do the one thing that your brain's been telling you might bring you certainty and safety. And so I always try to tell people it is incredibly difficult. And it's usually not the thing that people want to do in those moments, myself included. And it can be really hard to come around to the idea, at the beginning of like, all right, I'm just gonna dive in, I'll take that leap of faith and face it head on and just see what happens. But when people can do that, OCD can fade in the background and life is kind of waiting for you.
Yeah.
And OCD doesn't have to be something that'll keep you from living your life. But it does require a bit of a leap of faith and to face those things you're most afraid of head on.
It sounds like a big leap of faith to say, I don't currently trust the reasoning or the rationality in my brain and what it's telling me to do, but I'm trying to, you're almost controlling your brain to control your actions. And I can see how this becomes could in itself become a cycle.
Yes. And it does sometimes there's a form of OCD called existential OCD, which is what I'm feeling real or not? Is life real? We've had sessions about sort of like the Matrix kick off some of these. But it's sort of that anything it is, it's sort of needing certainty around what's happening. But with the idea that I have to know before I can live my life versus living my life and figuring it out as I go. I think that's sort of like the piece that a lot of times we'll kind of go with the process that is a big leap of faith. But the other thing I always say is we take leaps of faith every single day and we don't even give ourselves credit for it. And the number of things that we do as humans that technically could end in our death on a daily basis.
Yeah.
If you really think about it, it's astronomical.
Oh, yeah.
Walking outside of your...
We trust everybody's gonna play their part and everybody's gonna, fall into order. Yeah.
We jump in Ubers, we walk outside with an umbrella during a rainstorm and assume we're not going to get struck by lightning.
Yep. Yeah. Drink the water. I mean, everything. There's some inherent level of trust that we're hoping someone did their job the right way.
We have this cat in our home, and we hope he's not going to maul us.
Yeah, murder us, as he came very close to earlier.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that we do that every day as humans because we have to, right? To function, we have to embrace and allow for some uncertainty. And we forget that we do that every single day just to live and function. So we already know how to do it. OCD just kind of selects two areas and says, all right, you're not allowed to live with uncertainty here. Yeah. So sort of can you treat that the same way as everything else? Because you do already trust yourself to do that in a lot of other areas.
Yeah, it sounds, as with anything within mental health, it's so subjective to the individual's experience, and there's not an off-the-shelf, this is OCD and this isn't. There are variables that constitute what it is, but everyone kind of has their own experience with it for the people who have it. I don't know if this is a ridiculous question or not, but I feel like the way that, just bringing it back to my own personal experience with this, the way and how quickly my mom found it, just kind of by accident, and it was within the year that the symptoms started to present themselves. What you just said was really interesting, where I didn't really have time to map this as normal. These things had just started, and then I talked to somebody about it, and I was able to very quickly revert back to normal. And I never did some of the not crazy, but some of the behaviors again. I never rewrote again and scratched it out. I never walked in and out of a door again or flipped the light switch. I still had the thoughts, and I was able to kind of work through them knowing what it was. But is there a way that people are able to identify this in other people? Some indicators or signs that you would see in someone's life that could be concerning?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially if you're thinking about like kids, it's sort of like if they're starting to like do things over and over and over again, and becomes incredibly overwhelmed when they don't get to do it right, or it gets blocked, or something happens, and gets incredibly overwhelmed by the anxiety and the fear. That's a pretty good indicator that at least something's up. I think the other is that people start to like isolate away from others. So if they stop doing things that they used to enjoy, or have a hard time getting to things that they are trying to get to, but they just can't quite get out of the house and get there on time, and start avoiding places that they or people they used to like hanging out with. Because a lot of times OCD sort of is most intense at home, also most intense around those that are closest to you. And so a lot of times you might see it coming up there where people will sort of be changing the way they interact with loved ones. They might be avoiding them more, trying to like stay away, not wanting people to come into their room because of intimidation or fear of harm, or kind of keep a certain distance if it's fear of harm. So those can be small signs. So like stopping things that you typically like doing, difficulty or feeling overwhelmed trying to get places or do things that are important to you. And then spending a lot of hours on the same behavior sort of over that rigidity to it, where things have to be done a certain way and there's no flex because the anxiety is too intense. That's another good sign.
Interesting. So that would be in kids, in adults, well, I'm sure it works for adults too, but in adults, self-soothing, self-medicating, like do people say that alcohol or drug abuse helps kind of quiet or calm the urges?
Yeah, very similar to like PTSD and substance use and how they kind of like that cycle tends to go together with like the dual diagnosis. Kind of track. We see something similar in OCD. And one of the biggest challenges, so like alcohol a lot of times will calm it, but there's also a pretty bad rebound effect that people report. Like the next morning, they wake up and the obsessions are usually like intensified tenfold because then also there's even more uncertainty on what happens, or you put stuff off kind of inadvertently. So we do actually see a lot of self-medicating and attempts to either quiet the thoughts, get rid of them, neutralize them. But similar to their rituals, it tends to only intensify them over time. And we do know that things like alcohol use, use of like benzos to get that kind of immediate or anxiolytics for that immediate anxiety relief, actually tend to interfere with treatment and recovery because they become sort of ritualistic, meaning that immediate release versus kind of noticing that you can ride out the anxiety, that you can actually cope with it. So we do see a lot of comorbid substance use.
Yeah, because you're not learning those behavioral coping strategies over time. Yeah, and
exactly. Ultimately, it's still avoidance.
Right. Yeah. You'd mentioned like dual diagnoses. And you had said PTSD. Are there other sort of diagnoses that tend to go either OCD can lean into other diagnoses like anxiety, depression? We said isolation, things like that. Yeah. Are there certain ones that it can?
Comorbid depression is one of the most common. So just given especially the impact that OCD can have on one's life and your ability to function and the things that you lose because of it, comorbid depression is very common. A lot of times people will also have social anxiety is another common comorbid diagnosis, especially if you develop OCD early on because you sort of exit in severe OCD and you sort of miss those milestones because the OCD sort of takes over everything in your life. So you miss those major like developmental milestones sometimes have to play catch up. We also do know there's some emerging research that I've been working on with some colleagues that show that PTSD and OCD actually much more comorbid than we initially thought. Huh. And so we do see a high comorbidity between the two of those as well.
Interesting. That's a good segue to what I was going to ask, and we'll wrap up here in a minute. Where do you see the research going? Like, do you see it just kind of foundationally building on what's currently there, or is it going in new directions that you wouldn't have been able to anticipate even 5 years ago?
Great question. I think a little bit of both. I think our understanding of why things like exposure and how behavioral therapy work for OCD and how to make them more effective and efficient has actually built on itself a lot. Like as with the inhibitory learning kind of models and our understanding of just how our brains work and how we learn more effective strategies, I think that will continue to build on itself and become more refined and more effective over time. I also think we'll sort of see a lot more like augmentation methods, so ways to like enhance ERP and CBT, like integrate them together to make it again more efficient, enhance the learning that we have. But I also think there's a lot of, and I think what's the great part is there's a lot of new kind of interventions and directions that people are also looking into and testing and trying to figure out, like, are there other options that we can also use, be it for self-help or disseminate a little bit more easily for those that are struggling with exposures? Are there more cognitive methods that we can use to get them ready for it, or that might be effective as well? We also are seeing a lot in the neurotherapeutics realm, where as we understand the brain mechanisms underneath fear, and as things like anxiety research, PTSD research grow, I think we're seeing more and more novel neurotherapeutic and digital interventions that have a lot of great potential to be able to disseminate treatment to a lot of people more widely and more efficiently than we've been able to do so far.
That's great news. I feel like every area of research that at least that we've been having conversations with people about, there are treatment modalities that 5-10 years ago that exist now just because of how quickly technology builds upon itself, that they could have never even forecasted or even been able to anticipate. So it's exciting that OCD research is right in line with that.
Definitely. I think going back to that, 250 years.
Yeah.
Just imagine what we know about the brain in 250 years.
My
Might get some new insights given how much we don't know already.
It's wild to think about that. Do you think that with social media and everything else, just because understanding how OCD is triggered and constant like needing for assurance and things along those lines, has OCD just exponentially, or has social media and access to it and need for gratification, has that had a dynamic or a role?
Really interesting question. One we struggle with, I think, this is kind of like in our area a little bit, is like it's done some wonderful things for education and getting the word out, right? Also done some terrible things for getting the wrong word out.
Sure.
There's a lot of people who spend time trying to do things that really aren't empirically based or a misunderstanding of it. They can distill down into like a 60-second clip alone. But I do think that one of the things that has changed is it sort of has changed one individual's willingness to reach out for help because it feels more normalized, I think. If people can find the right information now, we've had a lot of people that have been willing to reach out for help and share what they're worried about earlier, and not necessarily be as ashamed of their thoughts, which I think is great. But I do think there's a reward element where when OCD latches onto social media, it can become really difficult to disentangle because there's just so many ways to get reassurance, to get feedback, so many areas of perfectionism. There's also things that just never go away, so like their triggers are always there, and comments, things like that for social elements. But also it's had a pretty big impact, I think, on depression. So there's definitely been a negative impact. I think it's changed some of the OCD things that we've typically seen and how people ritualize or how they engage with the obsession or which obsessions come up. And also a change on depression and isolation, which has been a challenge.
Yeah. Did you have anything else, Jen?
Just out of professional curiosity, if a baby therapist was looking to get better training or a deeper understanding of OCD, are there certain paths you would encourage someone to take, or whether it's books or
podcasts?
Yeah.
Well, we've already got started, so
there we go.
Conferences, maybe, just anything. Any thoughts on that?
So the International OCD Foundation, IOCDF.org, actually has a really great yearly conference and then a virtual conference that occurs every October, and an in-person conference in the summer, which is really cool because it's an academic research conference, all focused on OCD, but it also has clinicians, researchers, individuals with experience, family members, and friends all attend together. And so it kind of brings together all these different pieces. They also have trainings for therapists called the BTTI that teach the fundamentals of exposure response prevention, both for adults, and they have a pediatric one as well. Each state also has most states also have a local affiliate. They have OCD Massachusetts, we have a YouTube channel as well. But a lot of states will have local affiliates that have resources in their state, things like that as well. Maybe do some trainings. So I think those are probably would be great places to learn more, get more resources. At the OCDI, we do trainings for the community as well and have webinars at McLean Hospital and places like that as well that we talk about the fundamentals and do intro trainings. So I think those are really great places just to like get a sense of what's out there and what trainings are available.
Thank you so much. This has been really, really valuable. Tons of really great information. And I think it's a topic that, I mean, I only know about because I experienced it, but a lot of people, they think OCD, they think the people that are like, oh, I'm just being OCD when they're cleaning, and they just use it like a buzzword, when in reality, it's obviously so much more. So
Yes,
that was very insightful. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. This has been
Thank
great.
you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Tell Us More About That. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform it is that you're listening to us on, and also leave us a rating and review.
If you have any topics you would like us to consider, if you have any feedback or commentary, only if it's positive, please visit www.tellusmoreaboutthat.com.
Thanks again for joining in, and we will see you next time.
See ya.